Hey there gardeners, Chris from Garden Steading here today, and I wanted to talk about basically the cost of putting in this kind of raised garden bed so that you've got at least a simple point of comparison. Now, I'm going to be talking Australian dollars and what it's cost me, mainly buying a lot of the stuff from Bunnings as far as the garden beds and getting a soil delivery in a rural area. But I think what most people will find is if you just do a little bit of basic conversion, you'll be able to really get an idea of what you're going to be paying as well. Now, we're going to start with the cheapest beds that I actually started with. These are basically a no brand $28 special available from Bunnings. They are 1200 wide by 900, so that's 3 by 4 foot, which gives you, if you're talking about square foot gardening, you're getting 12 square feet to put your plants in. And as far as filling this with soil, starting with the soil deliveries I got, I paid about $115 per cubic metre. So that's 1,000 litres essentially speaking, which is 40 bags worth of soil. And to fill one of these, we're looking at $37 of delivered soil or about 13 bags. Keeping in mind that is filled right to the rim with no compaction. And also that's not taking into account a situation like mine where I've dug these slightly into the ground, which does reduce the amount of soil you need. If you're on a really flat surface and you're just plonking your garden beds down, it's probably going to be a little bit less of an issue. You're not going to lose a little bit of that depth the way I do. But if you're having to dig them into a hill, you will lose a little bit of that capacity, which means less soil is required. And importantly, that figure that I'm talking about is filled right up. So you're probably actually going to be like 10% below that, because you don't want your garden beds filled right up to the rim, because then everything just kind of overflows off them. So, good starting point. One of these garden beds, to get it down, filled with soil, you're looking at about 65 bucks, which I think isn't too bad. The downside of these no branded garden beds from Bunnings is they have these plastic corners, which I don't think are going to last basically the test of time. And so there is the possibility these will fall apart in a number of years as the plastic gets brittle. There is another option, which I've also tried, which is very, very similar, but a little bit more, and we'll look at that one next. Very, very similar option. This one is the Saxons garden bed. Again, it is 1.2 long or 1200 long by 900 wide, 0.9. So it is a 4 by 3 foot garden bed. I should mention both of these beds are 300 tall, so they're not quite as tall as some of the other options. And again, you're looking at the same fill of soil. So you're looking at essentially say $37 of soil delivery if you're paying $115 a cubic metre like I am. You're again looking at 13 bags to really fill one of these up. And yeah, this garden bed is $10 more. My recommendation would be to buy these over those no branded options, because these have a metal corner in them. They are going to last significantly better. I have noticed that the bolts and the nuts have been rusting a bit, which is a bit disappointing. Obviously, some cheaper hardware used there. However, I still think these beds will last the test of time better than those cheaper beds. And for just $10 more, if we're looking long term, one of these is going to set you back $75, which is not too bad for your 12 square foot worth of gardening and the amount of plants you can get in there. Okay, so moving to the other end of the spectrum, here we've got a Birdies garden bed. So really high quality garden bed. They've got the nice curved corners. This is a 2.1 metre by 1.2 metre garden bed. It's 370 deep, so it is just that little bit deeper, which is probably going to be nice in some circumstances. Again, particularly for me, because the backs of the garden bed are quite dug in, being on such a slope, which does mean if I was trying to grow, say, carrots in the very back of the garden bed, depending on how deep you've dug them in, you could have issues. Now, one of these is significantly more expensive. So the garden bed itself, 174 bucks Australian, but you are getting a fair bit more kind of gardening space in one of these. And as I mentioned, it's a much higher quality bed. With that in mind, we're talking about $98 worth of soil, which is almost 40 bags worth of soil, 37 bags worth of soil to fill one of these up. And while I did put some, twigs and some branches and some little bits and pieces in the bottom of these, mine are mainly filled with soil with a bit of coconut coir mixed in as well. I probably should have added vermiculite to all of my garden beds just to get a bit of an airier soil mix, but that's neither here or there because it's not really relevant to what we're talking about today. So the total cost of one of these garden beds is 270 bucks. So you can see there is a big jump from the very bargain basement options up to an option like this with a more premium garden bed. And obviously you need a significantly larger amount of soil. And that is why a soil delivery is really important, because it's going to save you heaps and heaps of money. I would say the soil delivery cost for filling the beds is about half of the cheapest bag soil I could find anywhere, and the soil quality is significantly better. But let's move on to some of the smaller Birdies garden beds to give you another reference point. Okay, so hidden behind me in this grass is actually one of the smaller Birdies garden beds. So the last one I looked at was the 8-in-1. This is the 6-in-1. It is again 370 tall, and being the 6-in-1, the biggest kind of size you can run these is as a 1.6 metre long and 600 wide, or alternatively, you can run it as a 1.3 metre long and 900 wide garden bed, depending on what you're using it for. And the benefit of it being quite narrow is if you have it up against a fence, you've only got, or a wall, and you've only got access from one side. 600 is ideal for that. I kind of lean towards preferring the 900 wide garden beds or even 1.2 metre wide garden beds because you get a lot more space to work with. And as far as one of these garden beds, so we're talking about a significantly easier soil fill, $49, and that is 17 bags of soil. So the total cost of one of these, the bed itself is again fairly expensive because it's a Birdies product. It is $98, and that's just bought, not on sale, anything like that. And then talking about the soil fill, we're looking at the $49 or so. 17 bags, total cost $140 to $150. I do like these as an option. I don't know that they're the best value for money, but they're pretty good. I'd probably say they're fairly close to the 8-in-1 garden bed, which again, you're paying quite a bit more for that bigger garden bed, but you get basically for twice as much money, twice the capacity, twice as much as you can grow. So I do like these, but not quite as much as the big garden beds. The one thing I should mention is, of course, these are a 5x2 as far as feet. So for your square foot gardening side of things, you're looking at basically 10 square foot. With the big one up the top there, that's actually 7x4. So you're looking at 28 square foot. So there is actually a big difference. And when you think about it that way, you're getting an extra really kind of 8 square foot if we're doing the comparison between kind of the value on offer. So sorry, to make a quick correction there, those figures that I've quoted are actually if you run it in the 1.3 by 0.9 metre loadout instead of this much longer and thinner loadout, which actually gives you the most surface area for your gardening. If you do run it in the narrower way, it brings the amount of bags of soil down to 14, and it brings the soil cost down to $41. Again, all using my comparison figures. So to just give you a very, very simple idea, it's 0.35 or 350 litres of soil in the 1.6 by 6 or 0.6, and it's 0.43 or 430 litres for the 1.3 by 0.9. So just to give you a bit of an idea, there can be quite a big variance depending on how you set up your garden beds. So this garden bed here actually demonstrates just the point I was making. Because we ran out of room before we hit the fence, this is actually one of the 8-in-1 garden beds. However, we ran it square. And so we actually had 2 panels that we didn't use. And you're probably thinking, well, that was a bit of a waste, but we just incorporated them into one of our 6-in-1 kits and made it significantly wider from memory. So it actually worked out quite well. The flexibility was really good. However, this is a much smaller garden bed. I'm not going to tell you what it costs to fill because, to be honest, I haven't done the math on this one because it's not really a complete garden bed. And yeah, I could do it, but I'm not going to. So one of the final examples is actually this garden bed here, which again is a Birdies garden bed. It is an 8-in-1 configuration in the largest 2.1 by 1.2 setup, but this differs because it is the 740mm tall. So it is significantly taller, double the height of the much smaller garden beds. The big advantage of this kind of bed is, of course, that it's much easier to do your gardening standing up. They're a much more natural kind of garden bed to use. The downside is, number one, they require a lot more stuff to fill them, not necessarily soil, but also the cost of the much taller garden bed, because it's basically twice the material, jumps up quite significantly as well. Now, to buy one of these garden beds, again, just the regular retail price. Sometimes Birdies do kind of special pricing. That's not what I got. I got this for 284 bucks. And so this is a hefty investment, particularly when you can save about 100 bucks to run the much lower garden bed. The future-proofing side of things, if you're a more elderly person or you have trouble with your back or anything like that, certainly I think these probably do come out in front, but you need to consider that. The big thing I did find, this was a much bigger job to put together because it's just a much bigger bed. It's harder to move around, it's heavier, it's a much bigger box, all that kind of stuff. Unsurprising, but it is what it is. And then if you were to fill one of these entirely with soil, it's almost 2 cubic meters worth of soil, because obviously these garden beds are enormous. So what did I work it out to? $197 of soil, or 74 bags. The total cost, if you were to do that, would be $500 essentially Australian, which is a lot of money. I think more realistically, we'd cut the amount of soil you'd need in half, because basically you do what I did. You fill the bottom half of the garden bed with twigs, with sticks, with branches. I was chopping up big fallen branches and chucking them in the bottom. What I did do is I got some coconut core in as well and put that in and mixed that in. And when I filled the bottom of the garden bed, I really tamped it in, not in an attempt to squish it down, but to fill all the air gaps, to make sure that there wasn't a heap of compaction that was going to happen really, really quickly, where the top of my garden bed as a result would fall dramatically. And the good thing about that is that it has worked. I've still got, you know, probably about that much at the top of the garden bed, between the lip of the garden bed and the soil level. However, I haven't had a massive drop in the soil level, and I saved myself about $100 in soil in not filling it fully up. And I think really, not only would it be expensive to fill it up that way, but the weight of the soil is going to cause a lot of compaction, and you're probably not getting any gains there, as compared to using that hugel culture kind of approach, where you fill the bottom of the garden bed with stuff that is organic, is going to break down and will also hold water, much like the coconut core that I added. So this here, I would say worst case scenario, 500 bucks. If you were to fill it with soil, not recommended. Probably about 400 bucks for the garden bed and the soil. And then you're going to need to find all your organic matter to fill the garden bed in the bottom with, to kind of get that soil level up where you want it, to be able to plant the way we have here. So yeah, I'll give you a final look at a much, much smaller garden bed, because it's just kind of a fun thing that I think you can also do, and that's probably not going to break the bank, but it could, depending on how you do it. Okay, so finally, hopefully you can see this little garden bed here. This is a round Birdies garden surround, I think they call it, tree surround. You could put herbs in it. 35 bucks for this little surround unit. They're 700 mils by 700 mils, so 0.7 by 0.7 meters. They're a square / round kind of design, a little bit bigger than 2 foot. And basically the reason I like these is if you're trying to contain something like I've done here, like a thornless blackberry or the raspberries I've planted in other locations, while it's not tall enough to stop kind of the roots and sappers from spreading out, it does just give you a little bit of containment, and it'd be perfect for a herb garden as well. Now, if you were to fill one of these just with your soil delivery, it's about 11 bucks if you really fill it up. But I found probably 2 to 3 bags of a quality soil actually does the job. And that's what I did at a much greater expense, because those bags of soil were say $13 or $14. But because I was planting blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, things like that, I went out of my way to basically buy a special soil like a gardenia soil that was more suited to those plants, and it did pump the cost up. So instead of it being say $46 using your soil delivery, if you use say 3 bags of a specialty potting mix, which is say probably, you know, $35 to $40 for those 3 bags, it's going to pump the cost of that garden bed up to $75, which is essentially what we paid for some of our cheaper bed setups. Is that going to be worth it? I would say so for some of the stuff. If you're getting productive blueberries or raspberries or blackberries and things like that, it's probably going to be worth the investment, but it just depends what your priorities are. So hopefully that gives you a really good idea of what your garden beds could cost you. I certainly don't have any regrets with any of my garden beds at this point in time, but it's been less than a year that they've all been in place. And really it's going to be probably the 2 to 3 year mark where we need to look at the cheaper beds and see how they've handled, how they've survived, whether they're still going strong. And then with those Birdies garden beds, which are a much more premium bed, I think it's going to be the 5 and 10 year marks when we see how they're going that'll really say how that investment has gone as far as value. But at the early stages, no complaints. It is a bit more expensive than I initially thought, and certainly going in, I've got a row of those 4 of the cheapest garden beds there. In front of that, I've got 3 of those basically $200 Birdies garden beds. In front of that, I've got another row of 3 of, I think, what basically ended up, again, $200 garden beds from Birdies. And then I've got a couple of those 6-in-1s, the $100 ones that I'm putting in as well. One that's in, another one I've got to get in the ground and filled with soil. And I probably need a couple more rows of these garden beds, which basically shows you that it adds up, especially using those premium garden beds like Birdies. I could have just gone with the cheap garden beds, but I'm a little bit of a snob. I do like the quality. I like the Australian made factor of the Birdies, and that is why I've got a bit of a mix, and probably the future purchases, unless I'm testing something specific, will probably be the Birdies garden beds. And I do keep an eye on their site and look for discounts, because if there's something on special, it could well be worth buying. And that's actually what I did with some of those garden beds. I bought the American spec garden beds that they had overstock of here, and I put, I think, 3 of those, or maybe even 4 of those were those garden beds, and I got a pretty good deal on them. So there you go. Got any questions? Let me know down below in the comments. Obviously, a big disclaimer, the cost of soil delivery for you could vary greatly, and these are fairly rough kind of measurements just to give you a ballpark figure.